Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Shalom, goedendag, of goedenavond, jammer. And welcome to another episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. That's Liberty and Friends, rather, on the BDL show. Welcome to it, Sanbonani. My name is Sikhle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. Guys, just a word of caution, please. There is load shedding in the area, so the power is meant to come back in about 30 minutes, so it will affect the stream quite a bit. In fact, it's already affecting my control panel just below me, which is acting a bit wonky. One of the things that is acting a bit wonky, pardon me, is that the Twitter stream is not on. So I'm going to see if I can try and troubleshoot that whilst we are nattering away here. Speaking about nattering away, make sure, please, that you hit that like button. There we go. We're live on Twitter. Excellento. Make sure, please, that you hit that that like button. It's your only price of admission. And hey, please share the stream, because we are, of course, running the show on a time that you're not accustomed to. This show is usually on a Sunday evening at 8 p.m., but we're running it on this Monday because I wanted to have a special guest with us to join the panel tonight. Speaking about that special guest, he is also having some issues connecting. Again, makes total sense. Guys, load shedding, I don't think you understand how it literally knocks everything out of sync. So I'm going to keep an eye on his comments just to make sure that he is able to join. Maybe on that note, can I ask for a quick 2 minutes, please, of your indulgence? And as I quickly sort this guy out and have him come onto the show. I'm with you. I just had to quickly do this. How are you folks doing tonight? I hope you're having a great evening, though. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to ask one of my fellow panelists, guests, can you guys please email the stream, please, to Dawie? He's actually just requested that on the WhatsApp group. I'm going to ask one of you guys, Nick or maybe Dumo, if you can just email it to him. Just check out the WhatsApp group to see what I am referring to. Sorry, guys, we're building it as we're flying. It is one of those evenings where the load shedding will make this show almost very difficult to broadcast, but we will persevere. We will push on. Okay, Dumo's on it. Perfect. Right. Well, now we're cooking with grease. Speaking about these guests who I'm referring to, let me bring some of them on. Dumo, I'll just keep you on last, just to give you time to email that link through to Dawie. A chap from the Institute of Race Relations. He's one half, of course, of the Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree podcast. Make sure you catch them on all your favorite podcasting streams. I'm talking, of course, Nicolas Lorimer. There he is on screen. Nick, good evening. Welcome to LNF.
How's it, Sikhle? Good to be back.
Brother, it is good to have you back, and God willing, the show will behave and the stream will behave, and we can actually have this conversation. I'm looking at you, CEO of ESCOM. Welcome to it, homie. Another chap who is a firm favorite here on the show. I always see the comments going pretty crazy when he's on here, including his epic rant that he had quite recently. I'm talking, of course, about one part of the trio at the Manpatria podcast. There he is, Koketso Resane. Koketso, good evening, and welcome to LNF.
Yeah, good evening, Sikhle. Good evening to everyone else. I make no promises that I will behave today.
I think that's exactly how the folks like you. Welcome to it, homie. Good to have you on the show. Dumo, I think, is still busy in the background. He might give me a thumbs up if he's done. Before I bring him on, there he is, onto the stream. The host, of course, of the Manpatria podcast, Dumo Denga. Dumo, good evening. Welcome to LNF.
Good evening, Sikhle. Thanks for having me on, and it's always great to be on the show.
Excellent, my brother. Excellent. Very, very good to have you on the show. We're going to wait for Dawie to hop on at some stage, but I think we should get into the conversation nonetheless. Let me begin with what is effectively the top headline. There he is. I'm seeing him on my control panel. But as I give him a second just to acclimatize, I'll bring him on in a second. That's Dawie Scholtz, of course, who is I'll call him an elections guru. You've probably been seeing his tweets, checking him out in the News 24 world. Let me just bring him on screen, even as I say that. Dawie Scholtz, good evening, brother, and welcome to Liberty and Friends.
Hey, guys, good evening. Thanks for having me.
Excellento. Guys, we can begin cooking with grease tonight. Remember, Liberty and Friends is my one long format show. We're here for 90 minutes. You're watching this conversation as we provide analysis and opinion of the news week that was last week. And really what dominated that news week were the local government elections of 2021. So we're going to unpack the results, the consequent coalition talks that are underway. A lot of bitchiness we're seeing from some political parties, a few snapbacks here and there. So we're going to have that conversation, but also talk about the political fallout. What does this mean for you in your municipality, wherever you may be? Remember, on Liberty and Friends, it is completely interactive. You, the viewer, are a part of the show. So get those questions in, especially because we have a wonderful panel tonight. Right. Well, with that being said, fellas, I was going to open the account tonight by saying, I suppose let's start at the very top insofar as where we are now, and we'll get into the data. I do have the IEC results dashboard on I'm standby on my other screen. I'll just have to set it up in a moment. But let's begin with the politics, I suppose, of it all. The coalitions are now well underway. You know, the corporate media has been asking these politicians, you know, who's approached who and who's going to have break that tough barrier, if I can call it that, of beginning the work of setting up a coalition for the metros in particular. Nick, let me begin with you. You know, let's begin with Joburg, perhaps. We'll just have the Joburg conversation. Very, very tough set of results that are now seeing almost very strained coalition talks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think Joburg is going to be probably one of the messiest. So for those who don't know, I was actually a DA councillor for a bit in 2016. And I saw the DA's attempt at a coalition with the EFF and MAN. That didn't go down too well. Now, they've said they're not going to repeat that mistake, and I don't think they will. But it's not going to be easy because even if you put, say, the DA and Action SA together, they still would need a whole bunch of other parties like the IFP, who in Joburg are a bit rogue. They, I think, have been in both the DA and ANC governments. And the Patriotic Alliance, who have a habit of switching sides in coalitions all the time. So I suspect that the most likely outcome in Joburg is probably going to be something like an ANC, EFF, IFP, PA kind of shoddy, half-functional ship going along that is routinely defeated in council by a sort of united block of other parties voting down stuff, but probably keeps the mayorship. So all I have to say to people living in Joburg like myself is buy a generator and buy gold.
All right. Already giving us a prepper talk, Nicolas. But guys, I mean, there's a conversation to be had here. Dawie, let me come to you. There's a conversation to be had here. Perhaps let me do it this way. Let me begin with an almost province-wide view, and then we'll select, as we then transition to discussing the metros, we'll look at the metros in a particular province. So I suppose in that regard, Gauteng province and what the metros there have begun to show us, Dawie, insofar as the data. Even as you're saying that, let me actually bring that on screen. I did have it on a second ago. Lots of any and all the provinces, this province, the Western Cape, and of course, KwaZulu, has many of these alternative colors on it. Opposition have done pretty well in Gauteng, Dawie.
Yeah, look, I mean, an absolutely extraordinary result, right? Like, this is the biggest shift we've ever seen in any particular election. And, driven by a couple of things. So I think the one thing which drove this result in a really big way is the extent to which ANC voters did not turn out to vote, right? So, I mean, I've done the numbers in detail now, but like places like Diepsloot, turnout was 27%. Ivory Park, Robbie Ridge, turnout was 35%. Soweto, turnout was 41%. So on average, like in areas that are typically ANC supporting, in other words, like township areas across Gauteng, turnout was about 41%, right? Then you go to like suburban areas, I don't know, Linden, Parkhurst, other areas where the DA in particular typically does well, turnout was like 55 to 60%. So that turnout differential really drove the ANC down and the DA up, and the Freedom Front Plus a little bit as well, and Action SA a little bit as well, actually. And then you go into the townships, right? And you're like, okay, well, only 41% of people turned out. What was the voting pattern, right? And you look at a place like Soweto, this is like 600,000 voters. In 2011, 87% of Soweto voted for the ANC. In this election, they were down to 53, right? Like from 87 to 53 in 10 years, it's a total collapse. 21% of the vote went to Action SA. The EFF is up to like 15% in Soweto. And that kind of trend is sort of across the entire province, right? So you have ANC voters staying away and historic ANC voters going to opposition parties, in particular parties like Action SA and a little bit to the EFF, and the DA kind of bringing out its traditional vote. And that effect is what drove the ANC down in such a big way, and it's kind of the same pattern across all those metros.
Dawie, I was about to say, let's stick to perhaps Gauteng and zoom into Johannesburg, because I think that's the tail right now. I mean, you brought up the Action SA as the the sort of catalyst of where I wanted to go here. I mean, look at that. Action SA literally trumping the EFF in a single election to become the third largest political party. This really does have something to say, or to say something, pardon me, around how people have been desperate, perhaps, or Joburg residents have been desperate for that alternative from either the DA or the EFF away from the ANC.
Absolutely. It's an attack on the status quo. And, the status quo has for a long time been this contestation between this duopoly almost between the ANC and the DA. And in some ways, the ANC and the DA are each other's best friend because, they're the perfect partners to oppose each other and to continue the duopoly. But I think a lot of people want to disrupt that pattern, right? So I think there are traditional ANC voters that want to vote for something else, but they don't like the DA because, they see the DA as like, quote unquote, whether it's fair or not, a white party, right? They feel like they can't vote for the EFF because the EFF is like too radical, doesn't really offer clear solutions. And I think for some of those voters, clearly in a place like Soweto, Action SA was a reasonable alternative, whether you agree with that or not. Clearly, quite a few people agree with that. But then exactly the same thing is the truth, I think, for some DA voters, right? So like in my voting station, I live in like one of these like DA voting suburban areas in the north of Joburg. And in my voting station, 20% voted for Action SA and the DA went -20. There are some like kind of white suburban voters in the north of Joburg who also want alternatives to the DA, probably because they want like a slightly more centrist, slightly more left-leaning party. And I think that's where that vote came in. It's people who want to disrupt the alternative. And this result, honestly, I think it's gonna build momentum for Action SA. This is gonna be a serious discussion. I don't think it's gonna go away. There are risks of it being like COPE in 2009, right? I don't think we can discard that. They have a lot of work to do to, get ready for a national election. But there's real potential here if they build on this momentum.
And again, maybe Dumo, let me bring you in because it's a point I've raised on social media too, that one has to be very careful. It's very easy to rally a new political party behind you when you get those initial results, and maybe those initial results are looking good, right? There's lots of winning, as Trump would say. But the problem is a political party is a day-to-day thing, and it's very difficult to it's very difficult, to cobble one together when you have as many a strong personality and strong egos as Action SA actually does. And I think we need some hard and honest analysis in this regard, because Action SA is and whether you want to view this as an unfair statement or not, I'll let you judge, but I've always argued that Action SA has two particular factions already in it. The one is former DA people who have a grudge and a point to prove to the DA, and the other, of course, is the coalescing of stragglers from various other parties, primarily the ANC. Those are two distinct factions that Herman then has to rally and herd like cats.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sihle. I mean, I think if that is the case, then Herman's probably going to have a very difficult time keeping the party together. That's not to say that he will not do so or that he's unable to do so. Perhaps he can. But again, yeah, I agree. He's also got a strong personality as well. Also, I think with regards to Action SA, I think now that they've got the votes and they can play kingmakers with regards to who becomes the mayor and stuff like that, I do think that wherever they are, in whichever ward they're in, they need to really pick up on that momentum, because the thing is that it's easy. Let me just say it's easier getting a lot of votes in the first election, but keeping that momentum going is very difficult as we've seen with COPE. And we saw how COPE broke up. People just left, and there was faction battles as well. And I remember there was one COPE conference where the faction battles became so intense that people started throwing chairs at each other and everything like that. So it was really, it can get that bad. And I couldn't believe it got that bad. Like, as a party that is meant to be an alternative for the ANC, just broke up just like that. So I think Herman Mashaba must take lessons from COPE. He must just try to keep everyone together. And if he can't do that, I do think he will become a much bigger political force in the future.
Well, let's maybe speak to that, Koketso, because even as we say this, things are looking pretty tense already. And I want to come back to that conversation about the nature of this coalition talks. If you've been watching the corporate media at all in the last couple of days, you would have seen that there is a lot of backhanding already and sort of tongue-in-cheek commentary being passed out. Action SA, for example, really going after the DA insofar as driving this narrative of being, it has to choose whether it's a quote, it has to choose whether it's a party of cutting grass in Sandton for the rich or one that delivers services to the poor. Herman going after them once again to say, maybe the DA needs to reevaluate its look at the EFF because that is what the ground wants or the Constitution demands. Are these really the sort of beginnings of coalition talks that are healthy in a broad sense? And why do you think also that there's a fear of these parties maybe even saying, hey, it might not be popular, but hey, let's maybe look at getting into a coalition with the ANC because maybe we can spur them on to deliver better because we're the better party?
Yeah, I think the DA is actually in a very difficult position between two rocks, not even a rock and a hard place, in that should they go into a coalition with Action SA, my initial thought there is that probably Mashaba would gladly get into that, provided he's the mayoral candidate, of course. That's one way to swing it, in which case, if he does become Johannesburg mayor, that actually almost guarantees Action SA growth long term. So I don't think the DA would want to do that. But again, what are the alternatives? Similarly, if you look at the EFF, there's a hell of a lot of work to be done in Gauteng's township areas. I don't want to just say Johannesburg because it's a very similar situation in Ekurhuleni as well. There's a hell of a lot of work to be done. 5 years is not enough time to actually, probably effect some change for everybody. You've got to pick your battles. And in that case, should they go into a coalition with the EFF, you'll quickly find that there's those areas where they aren't actually able to do much of the positive work that needs to be done. The EFF can then turn around and say, right, we went into a coalition with these guys, they didn't do anything, you're still poor, you're still living in conditions that aren't the greatest. So in that case, the DA's coalition with the EFF can play right into the EFF's hands and strengthen the EFF long term again. So it's a very difficult position to be in. But I mean, with all that said, I guess, I have to kind of be objective here and say that, look, this is a good thing. This does actually encourage the democracy project. I can say that it's only been about 27 years. And we are now not yet at the maturity level we want to be as a country, as a democracy, of course, but we are now starting to see, or let me say, pay attention more to the messaging of the different political parties. Previously, we just had, a very, two sides of a coin, really, in that there's the ANC or there's the DA. Now, because of what's happening with, a lot of smaller parties coming up, not just with Action SA, but I'm specifically looking at, the FF Plus. Obviously, Patricia de Lille haven't broken away from the DA as well. people are starting to pay attention to these smaller parties. Previously, this was maybe limited behind closed doors, maybe in provincial legislatures and the likes, but people are starting to pay attention now. And it's actually playing out very nicely, seeing how different wards actually vote for the people they want to see representing them. But for the DA, very difficult. I don't envy them at all. Something's got to give, and these negotiations probably aren't pretty.
And I was about to say, speaking about not so pretty, Dawie, I've just put it up on screen now. Ekurhuleni, a bit of a surprise factor for me, if I'm to be brutally honest. It was seen perhaps as, of Joburg, or pardon me, of Gauteng, the one area where the ANC does and did perhaps relatively well, but a complete collapse of the ANC in that part of the world.
Yeah, look, the ANC went -10 in Gauteng, right? They were 48, they're 38, right? They got clapped, -10. And look, I mean, the bad news, guys, is that in Ekurhuleni, there's only one way to 50, and that's ANC plus EFF. There is no other way to 50 in that municipality. So unless there's some sort of minority government play, it's likely that that's going to ANC and EFF, right? I think Joburg and Tshwane are the more interesting ones. Like in the case of Joburg, the ANC went more than -10, what they went like -12 or something. But there's fundamentally like two choices, right? There's two choices to 50. There's the ANC plus DA coalition, right? And I think that's going to raise all sorts of complexities. But a theoretical option, right? Mathematically, that gets you to 50. And the other one that is theoretically possible is basically all of the small parties, like led by the DA and Action SA and sort of all of the small parties. And you're in that situation, I think Nick was mentioning, it's like where the PA on a good day just decides they don't like this coalition anymore, the whole thing collapses and it's a bit chaotic, right? And you're in that situation again. So it's either those two options or minority government, right? Which is going to be pretty chaotic anyway. And then in Tshwane, the same situation, but just slightly better for the opposition parties. Probably there's a relatively stable DA, Action SA, Freedom Front plus Scope plus ACDP coalition to be had. That just scrapes it, but those parties, probably will be able to keep it together. But hey, it's going to be a mess. And honestly, I don't think anyone really knows electorally how this plays out beyond this year, right? So if the ANC forms a coalition with the DA, maybe DA voters revolt and they're like, we don't want to keep the ANC in government. We want to get rid of the ANC. Maybe DA voters go like, actually, that was the mature thing to do because it created a stable governance and we can actually get some basics done and we understand. Honestly, I have no idea how that's going to play out, and it's just going to be absolutely fascinating.
But it must be said, and I'm going to come back to you, Nick, because, and I think Dawie raises some important points, two in particular points. One, we're not really sure how this does play out, to be brutally honest. We don't really know where the sentiments are of the average voter insofar as coalition talks, because there does seem to be a fatigue, though, about coalitions, or rather, an apprehension around coalitions, given what happened in the last iteration of local government elections. A real apprehension, especially of those who live in those parts of the world, those parts of SA rather, where those coalitions collapsed and crumbled in spectacular fashion, such as PE, for example. But we'll get there. We'll get to the Eastern Cape in a moment. I just want to conclude our thoughts on Gauteng. But there's a conversation to be had here around people who look at this and are very apprehensive and almost fearful of two things. One, that ANC-EFF coalition, which I personally believe should happen, or B, the hobbling together of small opposition parties in what can be very fractious, as Dawie rightly pointed out, coalitions.
Yeah, I think people are right to be a little bit worried about what the coalitions are going to bring. That's why I was joking about buying generators and gold, because we don't have great experience with doing this, I think, around the country. And we have a lot of differences between our political parties, actually. Not just in terms of policy, but also in terms of personalities. I mean, a lot of the people who are leading Action SA in Gauteng are people who fell out very bitterly with people in the DA, where they really don't like each other, and it's going to be difficult to work together, which they might be able to do. And that's one of the more stable options, right, is DA plus Action SA. When you look at like the EFF and the ANC together, they have a lot of ideological ground that covers the same space, but there's also still vying for positions and power. But I do think we know a little bit more than perhaps most people are suggesting. I think it's unlikely that DA is going to go into coalition with the ANC or the EFF, unless Steenhuisen loses control of the party, which is not impossible, but I don't think it's likely. In which case, you're going to probably see these minority governments that Dawie was talking about. And yeah, I mean, that means that basically government is going to exist on a day-by-day basis, vote-by-vote basis, which you're gonna see. I wouldn't be surprised if there are, because I believe if a municipality is placed under administration, which can happen if they don't do certain basic things like passing a budget or hiring a municipal manager, if that doesn't happen, then you might see something like an election being held again in a certain municipality. I think that's how the System Structure Act works. I can't remember, but that would mean that we're going to be in for some tumultuous couple of years in which there will be a lot of opportunity for various parties, particularly in the opposition, I think, to really make a name for themselves, show their skill at managing this chaotic environment, and do some stuff for their voters. And I think this is actually why, despite the DA's losses, they're in a pretty good position, because they are sort of a bit of a strategic partner. They have a lot of power as being sort of the big dog of the opposition in a lot of cases. And they're going to, if they play that hand well, which they very well may not, but if they do, they could come out of it quite well.
If you're watching this conversation, welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. My name is Sihle Ngobese, Big Daddy Liberty. I'm in conversation, as you can see on screen, with Nicolas Lorimer, of course, who is one half of the Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree podcast, a chap who is, of course, part of the Daily Friend publication. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za. Koketso, Resane, and, of course, Dumo, Denga, the fellas from the Manpatria podcast. Make sure you check them out, like and subscribe on their various platforms, whether it's on Twitter or YouTube. That's Manpatria podcast. We have a special guest in the house, Dawie Scholtz. He is, of course, part of the News 24 team, who covered the elections very well. I must give them credit where credit is due. That's News 24, of course, a news outlet you can find online. They also produce a lot of content, media content, pardon me, outside of just written content. Sorry, I struggled with that for a moment. I'm back. Fellas, we're going to keep the conversation going, and I must move us. I did for a moment put up Tshwane on the screen. Dawie, I'm going to let you chew on this for a moment, because I think there's something he said which was very, very interesting, and perhaps Tshwane residents will be breathing a sigh of relief, because it seems as though that for them in that part of the world, a potential opposition coalition can happen without the EFF and can happen between parties which pretty much can see eye to eye.
Yeah, exactly. So in Tshwane, there is the route of DA, that gets you 32, right? Then you've got Action SA, that gets you another 8, then you're on 40. Then you add Freedom Front Plus, then you're on 48. And then you can kind of cobble together the final 2 points between, I think, ACDP as a percentage point and COPE as another councillor, which gets you over the line. And then you're just barely there. If you wanted to kind of play it safer and have a little bit more margin, you may bring in the DOP or the PA if you're able to get them in, right? And that actually is a workable majority in Tshwane. But again, I find it very difficult to believe that a deal is going to be made with Action SA in Tshwane without a comparable deal being made in Johannesburg. And so there's some real complexity here, and I also think some real maturity required from everyone involved, right? One way to read it is that it's mature from the DA's perspective to give the mayoralty to Herman Mashaba. Another way to read it is for Herman Mashaba to accept that he only got 18 or 16% of the vote and shouldn't be mayor on the basis of 16% of the vote. But either way, there's some real maturity required in that discussion. And I think Nick has mentioned it. There are also some folks who don't like each other very much in that discussion. So it is going to be complicated, but there's a bigger picture here. There's a real bigger picture towards 2024 that I think those parties will have in mind, and it'll just be very interesting to see it play out.
Absolutely. Perhaps on that note, let me leave Gauteng for a second, because Gauteng really is, amongst other provinces, a place where we saw those winds of change. if not winds of change that led us to hung councils, but winds of change nonetheless that have blown quite a bit. Let me come to a province that has almost a taste of that, or has one foot in both areas. Winds of change on the one foot, and the other being a stubborn insistence on the ANC retaining power. That is the people's choice, of course, which brings me to the Eastern Cape, if it just loads. Here on the IEC page, let me mention two areas insofar as looking at their metros. Remember, we're just keeping the conversation to the metros for now. We will look at other interesting areas in a moment. But in that regard, it brings me to Gqeberha, that is Port Elizabeth, if I can find it. There it is, the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality. Look at that, fellas. Firstly, and Dawie, I must come back to you just to open up this account. First things first, a almost spectacular collapse of the DA, who in the previous election, local government elections, were almost on the cusp of that 50% plus one that they argued in their election this time that they were seeking.
Yeah, it's so interesting, like across the entire Eastern Cape, the result that occurred was basically, from a turnout perspective, demographically, everything, a carbon copy of 2016. So the same election just rerun with one minor change. Colored voters in the Eastern Cape who backed the DA by like a significant margin last time around, like 78% or something voted DA. Only, like 61% of them voted DA in this election. So there was a splintering of the vote, particularly in like the northern suburbs of Gqeberha. That's a really important part for the DA. Like lots of colored voters, important to get turnout, important to get high DA numbers, and they splintered between a number of parties. And a lot of what the DA's campaign was about was, remember, they keep saying like, don't vote for independents, don't post your vote in smaller parties. It's versus the DA. It's between the DA and the ANC, and it makes a lot of sense why they did that now, because clearly they were seeing this risk of a splinter, and that splinter definitely took place. And that's where kind of the -5 came in. And that's basically why we have this super complex negotiation, because you have the ACDP with more votes, mostly coming from the northern suburbs. You have the Northern Alliance, which is a small little party, mostly with votes from the northern suburbs. You have the AIM, kind of with some votes, mostly coming from the northern suburbs, etc., etc. And that's why it's just going to be an unbelievably messy, super difficult coalition. There's basically no easy answer in Gqeberha.
And again, maybe on this regard, Koketso, what I know there are PE and Gqeberha residents listening to the stream right now who are just holding their heads in despair because they're thinking, once again. We're going to go through this nonsense once again, and this time with an even more splintered political landscape. What does one even say to that? Sorry, I'm trying to form this question because I'm feeling the frustration of a Gqeberha resident right now who's maybe watching this show and going, oh man, why are you bringing this up when we thought we were going to drink our problems away over this weekend? But there is a conversation to be had here, perhaps about the DA. I want to stick to the DA for a moment, because for me, this election was, and I sort of analyzed it by arguing in a previous vlog that they've had a good, a bad, and a ugly in this election. For me, the bad is really the assault it is facing from quote unquote smaller parties, where the DA always seemed to be the party that will be the one that is facing those battles on multiple fronts when it comes to smaller parties. And we're seeing it here in Gqeberha.
Yeah, it's part of my problem really with the South African electorate at large, in that, the DA did well for themselves last time around, got a chance to actually install their mayor this time around. But when people are unhappy, they're a lot more willing to actually take out their frustration on the Democratic Alliance, with the same level of frustration not afforded to the African National Congress and some of their partners. Well, maybe on Gqeberha, I must actually congratulate the voters there for actually, cutting down UDM in that particular metro. I think they've gone from a 6% last time to a 1%. So yeah, congratulations to the resident there. I can't remember the exact statement. Yeah, it was a very clear statement. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think Ethel Trollip's honeymoon period was probably around 18 months. And once Bobani came in the space of 6 or so months, he'd already spent more money in his tenure than Trollip before him. which just goes to show how far the script goes. So, yeah, a resident saw this and really cut the UDM down to size. I think they've lost their way. But yeah, my biggest problem though is still that why is it that when residents are unhappy, they are more than willing to punish the Democratic Alliance? Where's the same level of punishment for the African National Congress? Similarly, I mean, this pattern plays out throughout the country, and it's really sad to see how in the Eastern Cape particularly, they haven't punished the ANC in the same way. Look, if you're not happy with what your local government is doing, vote them out. Don't vote the same people back in. And unfortunately, that's exactly what's happened in this instance. The ANC is likely, I don't know, I think they're going to take it, given the EFF support and maybe a couple of others, unless, of course, the DA can deploy Helen Ziller there again. I don't know. But yeah, this is really a tough position again for the DA. It's just sad to see, however, that when all is said and done, the good governance of the DA in that short stint, that seems to have been forgotten this time around for some or other reason. Again, I'm just a guy in Gauteng, but let's actually see how it plays out. It's a -1 for the DA, yes, and I don't think they're going to make it through this coalition. Rather focus their efforts in other parts of the country, or even consolidating their gains back in the Western Cape.
And maybe to that particular point, Dumo, and then I want to come back to Dawie and then Nick. Sorry for this merry-go-round, chaps, but I do want to get the full spectrum of thought on this particular thought. I began this particular section when I spoke about the Eastern Cape by saying that, it has a foot in both spaces, so to speak, in terms of electoral results. The one being a representation of those winds of change, a move away from the ANC. The other, of course, being a stubborn insistence on retaining the ANC for whatever reason people chose. And Buffalo City is another example. East London, of course, is another example of that, insofar as a stubborn insistence on keeping the main or the status quo. Look at those numbers. The ANC weathering relatively well, 59%. If I was in the ANC, I'd be very happy in East London. Dumo?
Yeah, definitely. I'd also be happy as well if I was ANC. But, the whole of the Eastern Cape, I mean, it's just ANC, and that theme of just keeping the ANC no matter what, that theme is very big in the Eastern Cape. So, I mean, Buffalo City, I mean, I've been there a few times. It is a decent place. It's probably one of the most developed places within the Eastern Cape. And I think most of Buffalo City, it's still rural and stuff like that. But I mean, there's still developments here and there. But I think ultimately this is just something that that Koketso has been going on about, is that, where is the punishment of the ANC? It seems that many people, they would either vote for ANC and then, the EFF would be this alternative to the ANC. And if not, then they just do not vote. And I mean, I saw one of the comments earlier about Chris White talking about that there were many people that did not vote. And I mean, that also affected the results as well. So I think, it's kind of disheartening to see that even with a low voter turnout, you still see that the majority of the voters are ANC. However, there's also growth for other parties as well. But definitely within Buffalo City, I mean, this is, it's not surprising. I think this is probably the only metro that the ANC has, which close to 2/3 really. And it's not a surprise in my opinion, but definitely, it's not a good sight to see.
Well, let me pose the question to you. I see you, JC McFarlane, in the comment section. Shout out to you, JC. Actually pose the question. Dumo, I'll pose it to you first, and then I'll bring it to Dawie. Why is the Eastern Cape so in love with the ANC? Let me add to this question. Dumo, if you're someone who still watches about SABC and all of that, there's a show on SABC One called Checkpoint? Sorry, I might be crossing my Y's there. That's on ENCA. But there is another one on SABC that often goes to the Eastern Cape and showcases, the problems that people experience there, like serious problems, from not having water to, rampant corruption that sees stadiums, in inverted commas, being built. Like very clear signs of governance decay in that part of the world. But here we are in a situation where people are once again bringing the ANC back in righteous numbers. And by the way, it isn't just the Eastern Cape. You'll see the exact same numbers in Mpumalanga, in Limpopo. So clearly, the rural provinces a stronghold for the ANC.
Yeah, I think the reason why the Eastern Cape is so in love with the ANC is I just think it's become a brand there. You know, it's almost like Kaizer Chiefs and Pirates type of vibe where, you know, the people are going to just stick to there's this type of loyalty, there's this brand loyalty that exists. So I think within the Eastern Cape, it's quite big, because even when I go there sometimes, I even see some family members, you know, they'll have these ANC T-shirts, or sometimes you'll see on their WhatsApp, they'll be celebrating someone becoming a ward councillor who's a family member and everything like that. And it goes without question that they're the ANC. So I just think it's almost like a brand loyalty at the end of the day. The ANC managed to establish themselves as a strong brand, and they stay in the minds of many people. And if any other party wants to infiltrate that, I mean, think about it. Look at UDM. UDM is like only full of Xhosa people there, but they can't break that. They can't even break the ANC brand, even though they're more Xhosa than the ANC, if you really want to put it that way. So ANC really is just it's a strong brand. And trying to break that and trying to get into the minds of many, you're really going to have to work very hard.
Dawie, I must throw that question to you. As I said, I began this particular segment by arguing there are still parts of this country where the ANC has a very strong loyal base, including mostly in your rural municipalities, and not just the Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and they're like, but JC once again posed that question. Why though? Why do we think we're still seeing that?
So I'm going to give a long-ish answer because I think it's nuanced and complex. So
sure.
The reality is there was some polling done before this election, right? And it asked people, is South Africa on the right track or the wrong track? Okay. And 70% of people, including a majority of ANC voters, said South Africa is going on the wrong track. We are actively, going backwards as a country. Okay. And so that's 70%, right? And I think, the vast majority clearly believe that. I think, probably everyone in this discussion and most people listening to this discussion probably agrees with the thesis that South Africa is at this point headed in the wrong direction, right? But it's interesting that 30% of people still think that South Africa is headed in the right direction. And so it implies to me that there's a kind of hardcore loyalist group of people who love the ANC because of liberation, who have kind of deep historical roots connected to the ANC, who identify with the ANC at a kind of personal identity level. And so probably there's a group of people who will never think about voting for someone who's not the ANC, right? And we must accept that, and that's their good right, and that just is, I think, the way it is. Having said that, however, the 70% that says wrong track is growing all the time, right? So the amount of people who are either frustrated to the extent of not voting for the ANC, or frustrated to the extent where they're willing to think about not voting ANC, is growing with every single election. And that is actually quantitatively what's driving this election. So the real question, right, is for the opposition parties, those people that are formerly ANC voting, that are annoyed with the ANC, that think we're headed in the wrong direction, how do you get them to, one, turn out, and two, vote not for the ANC? Because everyone in that portion of the pie basically faces a kind of a bit of a decision tree, right? Their first choice is, am I going to go vote or not? And a lot of people are deciding not to vote. They're like, I'm annoyed with the ANC, but I'm not going to go vote, okay? And then for those that decided to vote, there's a choice about, okay, I'm annoyed with the ANC, I'm going to go vote now. But some of them are still voting ANC. Some of them are choosing to vote for opposition parties, right? And then there is a question fundamentally about what drives those voters to continue voting ANC, because that's actually the very nuanced point, is that voters that are frustrated with delivery still voting ANC. And I will say something which I think will be controversial in this audience, but I would love to get to that. And my thesis is that the ANC is perceived as the only party with a credible transformation and redistribution plan for South Africa to create access to the economy and a better life for all. Now, whether you think it's fair or not that the ANC is the only party perceived that way, I think a lot of voters have that perception. The DA is seen as not having a set of policies that actively addresses racial inequality. And the EFF is seen as, yes, they kind of seem to be talking about racial inequality, so that's great, but they're super radical, and I don't really believe that they're going to be able to do what they're saying, so my only real option is the ANC. And so the question is, for 2024, there is enormous mathematical potential for an opposition party if it can position itself as a party that can credibly deliver this kind of continuation on the journey to a better life for all. And the DA may be able to do it if it rethinks its positioning a little bit. Happy to chat about that. Action SA is certainly a potential contender in that. And then maybe there's a small set of parties that in certain pockets can do that, right? But I think that is fundamentally what's driving this, is the belief that the ANC is the party that can deliver the only one with a real plan, even if they're executing it in a really crappy way. Even if they've got horribly corrupt people, they're the only ones with an actual plan towards that. And I think that belief is fundamentally what's driving this continued loyalty to the ANC, even with people who believe we're on the wrong direction.
Well, let me push back, and I'll bring it to you, Nick. Let me push back and differ, because I think you are making a very, you're introducing complexity in an argument which I think is actually more simple than that. Or, I think the reasoning is perhaps more simple insofar as answering the question, why are we seeing the rural parts of the country still persist with the ANC? I think it's much more simpler, which is basically this. In rural parts of the country in South Africa, you don't see a diverse distribution of income as you would in urban centers in the country. Let me be precise and specific. Insofar as where the economy in this country is concentrated in its ability to provide diverse sources of income for people, you'll see that mostly in urban centers and not in rural areas. So that the lived reality of someone who lives in a rural part of the country is that their income and source of sustenance primarily has been from the state, a state which has an ANC brand slapped onto it. Why? Because in most cases, the ANC makes no distinction, for example, insofar as state and party. It purposefully conflates those two in order to make the argument, for example, as it sometimes does, that if we lose the elections, as we sometimes heard the ANC suggest in campaigning, if we lose the elections, they'll say, those evil whites will come back and will take away all of these quote-unquote gains that we've put in place for you, whether it's the welfare or the dirt road or the EPWP jobs. Their entire rural economies is linked to what a patronage network of an ANC welfare state provides for them. So that's actually what you're really fighting against. Perhaps if you are an opposition party in that part of the world, you're fighting against a patronage network which is linked to welfare on the one side, and on the other side linked to the foe, the illusion of jobs as they come to most people in rural areas by way of extended public works programs. I don't know if what your thought is on that, Dawie. I'll come to you back just to push back if you disagree. But Nicolas, let me begin with you. What your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a point that the IRR has been making for a long time. We do polling pretty much every year, saying, we ask people, what are your main priorities? What are you interested in? And then we offer them sort of a set of questions which are like options, saying, do you want, would you prefer more redistribution or more growth? Kind of that sort of question. I can't remember the exact wording of the questions now, but you can look it up. We do have it on our reports, and we generally find that people actually prefer what we might call a more centrist way to things. The redistributive stuff, the sort of social justice stuff that the ANC talks about. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are keen on it, but actually most South Africans, when you ask them, kind of prefer a more moderate, middle-of-the-road approach. And I think one of the reasons that's not really talked about for why ANC support is so strong is actually that the ANC is an institution in the country that has reach like no other. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, there is a branch in every single ward of this country with an ANC branch that is active and has active members and is constantly campaigning, is talking to the community about politics and stuff. And we have a population that is pretty turned off when it comes to engaging with the media, engaging with politics. Something like half of voters, I think that we did a little survey this time. We didn't do as much polling as we did last year before the election, the IRR did. And something like almost half of voters, not quite, didn't know who John Steenhuisen was. Which it's not a good thing if you're in the DA, right? Because people don't even know who your leader is. And I think that a lot of people, their real only contact with politics, their only source of information and engagement with politics is the ANC. And so when you say to people in a lot of parts of the country, particularly the more ANC strongholds, this is the problem. This is what's going on in politics. They basically assume you just mean this is what's going on in the ANC. The ANC is like this great hegemonic force. And I think that really is the thing that has changed this election, is that is far less the case than it's ever been. And I think the general population is going to see that. What the results of that are, I don't really know, but I suspect the ANC is not going to like the results of that.
Well, that's the frightening part in this particular instance. Let me just quick, Koketso, let me come to you, and then I'll go back to Dawie as I also move us fellas to another part of the country where we saw those winds of change, which is KZN, of course. Whoa, is there not a story to be had there in that part of the world, my home province? But Koketso, I think this is a worthy conversation to tease out. The stubbornness of rural provinces primarily to see a transition away from the ANC. There must be, look, don't get me wrong, multiple things can be right, multiple things can be true on this particular issue, but for me it does seem as though it is a big factor to have a brand like the ANC be synonymous with a type of an economy that has developed in rural parts of the country, which is mostly welfare status and seen as being dependent on the big man in your area, the big man politician in your area.
Well, yeah, that's very true. Just to throw a spanner in the works here, if you look at rural KZN, I believe most of rural KZN actually voted for IFP.
Yeah, boy.
But in terms of sheer numbers, they obviously then don't make up the same kind of numbers that the metros do, or let me say the larger parts of KZN. This just goes into, the realization that perhaps if you out in the rural areas, living life simply, you definitely, according to KZN's map, that is, you definitely align more with the IFP's messaging. And let's not kid ourselves here. That is a very hitting home, quarter to nationalist a message that comes across, right? Almost talking into the preservation of our Zulu culture and the prosperity of our people almost. That kind of messaging is very strong in KZN, and it's almost tribal, but you don't really see that, or you start losing that as you go into urban centers where, exactly like you're saying, people are more concerned with, attaining some sort of wealth somehow. But I mean, with that said, though, right, the question then is, are we at a point then where we can safely say that the more people urbanize, the more they actually start voting for an African National Congress, particularly in more remote parts of the country? Case is an example here that if you take KZN, of course, that scenario plays out. But do we find more of the same inside of Free State, where Bloemfontein surrounds, are looking at maybe your more traditional party base? Maybe maybe those people are in the ANC already. Is that not what we're seeing inside of the Western Cape now, where, again, if you go to maybe a colored township area, those are some of the people that have actually gone away from the DA and into maybe some more home-based representatives? I don't know if that's the pattern that plays out here, but if you look at what's played out in KZN, particularly with eThekwini, I think the messaging is quite clear that the more people urbanize, the more they become open to alternatives. And this time around, that alternative isn't necessarily the ANC, or let me say going from IFP into ANC, but actually looking at some of the other parties. And that's why I think DA has actually gone into the double digits this time around.
Well, let's look at that. And Dawie, let me bring you in there, because I think we just clear that up, because the data perhaps points to something different in that part of the world. Let me just bring it on screen. Look at that map, guys. Come on. First things first, let's give kudos to where it belongs. The IFP really have begun their journey of bouncing back in that particular province, and not just because of what happened in northern KZN, also what is happening towards the west of KZN, and of course filtering slowly south, very slowly in that case, of the province. Dawie, talk to us here. What are we seeing here?
Just enormous shifts, guys. Like KZN was an explosion in this election. I think there are like four things to mention, right? So The one is this turnout phenomenon that I spoke about in the other places, absolutely also true for KZN. So opposition voters, white voters, Indian voters, but also IFP voters in the northern part of KZN turning out way more than voters in like historically ANC areas in, for example, Umlazi and eThekwini, right? That was really interesting. So this turnout effect. So there was a massive ANC stay away in KZN. That's the one thing. Then the other thing is, as you rightly said, kudos to the IFP. They made a huge recovery in northern KZN, but also quite significant inroads into eThekwini. So that's part of why the ANC lost eThekwini, is the IFP made some serious inroads in there. And then it must not be ignored, the EFF more than doubled their support in eThekwini. They got 4% last time. They got 10% this time. They're making inroads into urban KZN. So the EFF is on the up and up. And then the final kind of two ingredients is the DA kind of staying stable with all of its voters. So you will recall, particularly with white voters in KZN, they were down in 2019. They're sort of back up a little, not all the way back to 2016, but back up a little. So doing relatively well and staying stable. So I think they got 26% last time, staying stable 26. But then with Indian voters, the ANC just got like smacked with Indian voters in eThekwini. I think their votes like half.
Surprise.
Yeah, they got
Surprise,
30%.
surprise.
They got 30% in 2016. They're down to like 10, 15 in areas like Chatsworth, Phoenix, right? And the Indian vote may not be significant nationally, but in eThekwini, it's a big chunk. And that really hurt them in eThekwini as well. So they're down from 57 to 42. It's like a shocking collapse. And by the way, my final comment on this is there must be a discussion in the ANC and just in general about what the internal ANC dynamics are about this. Like what the discussion was internally in the ANC before the election by certain members of the Zuma faction in KZN. And what the discussion is now. I'm sure it must be an extremely spicy discussion internally in the ANC.
Absolutely. Dawie, let me hop on that because I can give you some insight into that particular conversation. First things first, the ANC in KZN is incredibly fearful. They are incredibly frightened by what they saw because they genuinely didn't believe. And here's the nice thing about the ANC in KZN. A lot of these chaps are my friends. A lot of these chaps who are now the influences in the party in that part of the world, I went to varsity with. They're actually very good friends of mine and are good people on a personal, interpersonal level. And I can tell you now, they had no sense that these numbers are coming, even as I warned them. I said, listen, you're not going to survive a situation where an internal ANC factional fight breaks out on the streets of KZN and Gauteng by way of those July riots, where you're seeing the quality, and worse yet, the outcomes of which have been that the quality of life for the ordinary KZN, and let me be precise and specific, because I live in Durban, I live in Umlazi, that's where I actually live. The quality of life for that chap who lives on a shack on a side of a hill in Umlazi has been that services that used to be within his local area, now he has to travel twice the distance in order to access them. Why? Because the local mall was burnt down. The ATM in his area was looted. The roads where he lives were destroyed. The infrastructure where he was literally destroyed. That chap was bitterly angry at the ANC. And if you think back, if you remember back to an episode I did where I spoke about the nature of the campaigning in Umlazi, I told you there and then, I gave you an insight into this happening. And I said, listen, you're watching a situation where the ANC, two things were happening as they were campaigning. One, during via their loud hailers, as they drive around the neighborhoods, they were actually driving around apologizing to people. They were saying things like, oh, please vote ANC. We're really sorry about what happened. Mistakes happen and all that. I'm not joking. This is literally what they're saying. Mistakes happen. You know how it is. My lighting situation collapsed here.
Can I say one thing while you fix your lighting?
Go ahead.
In Umlazi, turnout 31%. ANC used to win 82%. They're down to 57%. Total collapse.
Tells you everything you need to know. That absolutely, Dawie.
Just devastating.
And you know the funny thing, Dawie? I mentioned this even on the stream. And I said, listen, what's happening now is there's a clear and present us and them thing happening in Umlazi, where you'd see ANC people gather in their party colors and walking around, and Umlazi residents just folding their arms and saying, you guys, Gambe, oh yeah, is this you now? I warned you about this even before these elections started, and people was like, no, the ANC wins Durban outright and comfortably. I was like, good luck with that. Good luck with that, because there is a clear anger a very clear anger in this election, and I told you it was going to happen. Sorry for that little rant, but I had to get it out there because it seemed as though reality quickly slapped the ANC in the face, and boy oh boy did they not like that. Dumo, and then Nick, let me come to you, because for me, KZN tells a very strong story of where we're heading perhaps for the 2024 elections, where a bitter and very angry and hurt electorate are saying, you know what, to hell with the ANC, there's no hope in hell, pardon me, for me to bring you guys back when we saw what you did to lives, when we see how our quality of life is at the moment. And maybe the IFP needs to capitalize on that, Dumo.
Yeah, I think the IFP will have to capitalize on that. I mean, of course, voter turnout was a big theme in this election. And I think going back to what you said earlier, where people have been frustrated, they just decided not to go to the polls and vote. And this hurt the ANC deeply. Now, I think that now the IFP, what they're going to have to do is those disgruntled voters, they're going to have to go to them and get them to vote for IFP, so that if things do get better in terms of just voter registration and so forth, they can capitalize on that. I think what we don't want is a situation where they punish the ANC now, then the ANC tries to do something about it, and then everyone just votes ANC again in the 2024 elections. I think the IFP and all other opposition parties need to capitalize on this. You know, all the disgruntled voters, they need to sell their party and show why they should be voted for. This is the perfect opportunity to do so, especially when you had a voter turnout in the country that is 46%. So what I'm hoping for is that the IFP does gain more ground. The ANC does need competition in KZN and also all over the country. And it's good to see that they got like 24%, which is actually very good in my opinion.
And Nick, let me come to you, because I think the one thing missing from this conversation is context also. Because KZN residents will also look at the ANC in relation to other issues which maybe you and I didn't think would come up, but actually have come up. I've mentioned the July riots, but the other issue also, and I saw the young Durbanites brought it up here. Shout out to the young Durbanites. The issue of the Zulu King, to an extent, would have come up, where it seemed as though the ANC, pardon me, the IFP, it seemed as though that Ubuthelezi, in his role as the Prime Minister of the Zulu Nation, undertakes this big process to bring stability to the Zulu Nation, to install a new king, or to assist, pardon me, in the installation of a new king. That seemed to have, given the circumstances and what could have happened, that seemed to go relatively smoothly, and then enter the ANC using the institutions of states to essentially corrupt the process and create the strife that we're seeing now. I'm of the view, it's a minority view, of course, I'm of the view that things like that also played a part in how people view the ANC in this part of the world.
Yeah, I suppose I think that there is a lot of truth to that. Look, I'm not very clued up on the politics of the royal household in KZN, but if you're going to vote for a party, if you're unhappy with the way the Zulu King situation was handled, the party to vote for is probably the IFP, right? And I think the ANC were caught napping on this one. You know, they probably wanted to get someone in there who was a minion to help control the rural vote, as happens, I think, in the Eastern Cape a fair bit. And they didn't get their guy in, is my feeling. And so they had a bit of sour grapes, and that certainly didn't help them. And it certainly boosted the IFP. I think you're right. With regards to the July riots, I remember thinking when they happened, and I think I said it on the Daily Friend show, this feels like a sort of corner-turning moment. And I think in KZN, that's definitely the case. The fundamental basic thing that a government has to do is ensure safety, security, law and order. That's the bottom line. And law and order for at least a week collapsed entirely in parts of KZN. And voters are not going to forgive that. With all the advantages the ANC has built in of its size, of its name, of its history, of its reach, it didn't do it as well as it thought it would in KZN. It thought, KZN, rural, we're going to win it forever. Zuma endorsed us in the end. We don't have anything to worry about. And, well, that kind of, I don't know what color to call it, that sort of orangey peachy smudge on the map shows that that indeed wasn't the case.
And this is perhaps where the bubble is burst. Guys, don't worry, I will move us on in a moment. It's just that KZN is my home province, and I do want to dwell on it for a moment because I think there's a story to be told here around where this province is potentially going in this upcoming 2024 elections. Dawie, I'll come back to you, and then Koketso. The story for me is really this one. If we're going to see a continuing trend of low voter turnout elections, then it surely must stand that he who builds his base from now to 2024 elections and brings that base out to vote in the election will win the election. Or am I wrong in that assessment, Dawie?
I think you're a little wrong. And let me say why. So I think that it stands to reason that even if it is a low turnout national election, turnout will be a little bit up from where we are now. Like in every couple, if you consider a couple being a local government election and the national government election that follows thereafter, for all of post-94 South African democratic history, the national government election has always had a higher turnout than the local government election. So because there are just some more folks who go out to vote, they realize it's national government, it's important to them, they go vote, okay? And it's particularly more ANC voting folks. So this enormous gap between kind of, DA voters and ANC voters and the DA voters turning out more, it still exists in national government elections, it's just smaller. So now, all of a sudden, the makeup of the electorate is different and it's slightly more favorable to the ANC. And look, we need to, we don't know to what extent turnout is going to be higher, right? And to what extent ANC will recover some of the people who didn't vote. We just don't know. But the only evidence that we have is historically turnout goes up a bit and some of those ANC voters go and turn out, okay? So then it stands to reason that, yes, I think you're right. Just maintaining your base and turning out your base obviously is important. I'm not saying that's not important. But
specifically growing your base, sorry, just for clarity, say growing your base.
Yes.
And
so that's what I was about to say.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it is going to be critical for 2024 for the opposition to make deeper demographic inroads into the communities that vote ANC, right? So the ANC got 53% in Soweto in this election. They need to be at 49 or 48 in 2024, right? They got, 57 in Umlazi? They need to be 52, 53, probably. Just to stay at this level. Okay, this level was 46, right, nationally, which was really damn low. But this extra turnout boost gives them, like, basically those 4 or 5 percentage points they need. And so to make up for that turnout, you can basically assume a flat line, further inroads for the opposition, basically into the black electorate of 5% required across the country, right? And that is what is vitally required for the ANC to go under 50 in 2024. And it will be fascinating to see the extent to which the opposition parties, A, try to do it, B, succeed in it.
And maybe before you move on, Dawie, before I throw it to Koketso, a question on screen now from Ubandile Ngiti. Shout out to you, Bandile. To what extent does this election also reflect the short-term issues of COVID-19 and lockdown versus perhaps the long-term rejection of the ANC? Can you also make that separation? Because ultimately lockdowns were an ANC government policy.
Yeah. Look, no one knows, right? So we have a lot of data on what happened. The modeling I've done tells us in detail what happened. It doesn't tell us why it happened, right? We can only speculate. My and this is speculation now, but my speculation is actually that these are structural trends because it happens in every election. Turnout knocks down a little bit. Some more ANC voters don't vote. Of the people who vote, some of them flip from ANC to other opposition parties. It's just constantly happening in every single election. And so my hypothesis is it's a structural trend. It's about the 70% who are unhappy with the direction the country is in. And, you know, the structural issues that are driving much of the pain in South Africa, unemployment, Eskom, electricity, lack of delivery of basic services, one doesn't imagine being turned around. Even if you had like the best, you know, whoever you believe the best party for delivery is, let's assume for a moment you think that's a DA. Even if you had the DA with a 2/3 majority in every municipality in the country, these things take forever to turn around, right? The tangible improvements are not necessarily going to be in place by 2024. So we can see these frustrations continuing to build, and therefore I think my hypothesis is that it's structural and that the ANC is not necessarily going to lose, but is at real risk of losing the 50% in 2024.
Absolutely. Koketso, I'll let you conclude the KZN story for a moment because I must move us to the Western Cape because boy, oh boy, there's a lot of movement there too. And Dawie, I need you to help us unpack that because there's a few hung councils and the story of independence comes into the conversation. We'll begin it in the Eastern Cape and then we'll head to the Free State, Harry Smith in particular. So just stay with us if you're watching. This is Liberty and Friends. Ooh, we're in that last 15 minutes of our conversation. I might ask our viewers, or pardon me, the panelists, to indulge me just with another 30 minutes, if possible at all, because I do think the conversation is beginning to cook with grease. Welcome to it. Remember, folks, the only thing I require of you here on Liberty and Friends, hey man, hit that like button. I see there's nearly 300 of us on all platforms watching, probably more, but hit that like button. Bring my engagement, please, over 50%. Whether it's a like or a dislike, hit that like button, please. Do it now. Remember, if you hit that like button, then 5 kids in Africa get fed. And the World Food Program becomes very happy with me, as it was with Elon Musk. Just kidding, but hit that like button, please. And we get this conversation going. In conversation with Nicolas Lorimer from the Institute of Race Relations and the Daily Friend. Of course, that's www.dailyfriend.co.za. Koketso, Resane, and Dumo Denga from the Manpatria team. That's the podcast, of course, Manpatria. Find them on YouTube, please, and subscribe to their channel. And of course, Dawie Scholtz, independent analyst, and who you've probably seen quite a lot on the news as part of the News 24 elections team. Shout out to the News 24 election team. They actually really did a very good job in covering these elections. Shout out to them in that part of the world. Let's move this conversation on, as I said, Koketso. Before I do, let's come to Koketso, the KZN story, because, you know, for me, it does seem, and again, I must be frank, I must put my cards on the table here. I'm very happy with what I saw in KZN. You literally saw a press conference by the ANC, post-election press conference, where Sikhe Zigalala and the other chaps in his leadership were and you could see the unhappiness in their face. And someone who's a resident like me who was scarred by what we saw in those July riots and really what's been happening to beloved cities like Durban, for example, for those of us who grew up in Durban and have watched that city decay over time, we were very happy to see that the unhappiness that the ANC put on us suddenly was felt by them insofar as the results.
Yeah, but there's just one problem with that, in that this unhappiness was largely expressed by people not turning out to vote for opposition. It was more expressed by guys staying at home and deciding that they're not going to vote for the ANC as they would have done perhaps in the past. That's the really unfortunate part. But I think really maybe to wrap it up with KZN, I think the ANC had a lot of work to do there, especially post the riots, and they just didn't do anything. We saw how Cyril Ramaphosa was basically on a roadshow throughout most of the country, really, going out and showing face to the voters' roll and saying, "Look, vote for ANC. We understand your frustrations, your pain. We promise to do better." I don't think he did that enough in KZN, perhaps because he was expecting a hostile reception. He could have easily gotten some low-hanging fruits by just paying homage to the Zulu king there and having conversations with them, and then coming out of whatever they talked about during lunch and saying, "Guys, remember to vote." And obviously, here I am wearing my ANC regalia. He didn't do that, instead leaving it to Sikhe Zigalala, who's a very unpopular person at this point in time, because remember, the riots just happened the other day, and this ANC was actually not just the ANC, but government as a whole, an ANC-led government as a whole, was seen as more reactive than proactive. You know, we can talk about Phoenix all we like, but at the end of the day, what if it was Cato Manor? You know, what if it was even in the hills, in Hillside? You know, what if it was in Westcliff? The reality is what happened in Phoenix could have pretty much happened anywhere, and the reaction would have largely been the same. So the ANC had a lot of work to do in KZN, and they didn't do it. And in response, people didn't vote for the opposition. They just decided to stay away. When the national election comes up, people are going to now have short memories and most likely go out and turn out for voting this time around, entrenching the ANC and having Sikhe Zigalala's replacement, or even Sikhe Zigalala himself, remaining as the installed premier and handing over control of the entire province back to the ANC, even though there's a lot of people that want to kind of move away from that. It's unfortunate, but that is what it is.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not blind to that. And I think that's a very powerful point. But I'm also not going to knock the non-voter, because that in and of itself is a very powerful statement to make. A very, very powerful statement to make. And if anything, we shouldn't blame the non-voter or the person not turning out, but rather make the argument that it presents an opportunity perhaps for opposition parties to say, hey, if that's going to be the case, if in other words, if the ANC voter is not going to turn out, then actually maybe the imperative for me is to, as I said, grow your base and bring it out to win the election. Maybe that is the pathway to an opposition party winning the election. Who knows? But with that being said, guys, I'm just keeping an eye on time. I know not all my guests will be able to stay with us, so let me move on, pardon me, to the Western Cape, because it really does begin to bring out the story of the independents in this election. And maybe we'll also answer the question, are these various movements who beforehand were telling us, oh, independence are the way, and we're bringing out the independents, maybe is this their pathway to claiming quote unquote influence in this election? For example, the what's Musi's thing, by the way, one SA, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, is this his moment to brag? Perhaps in that regard, Dawie, let me come to you. I'll have you open up the account for us. Here's the Western Cape. Look at that mishmash of colors. There's various towns in the Western Cape, Dawie. I don't know where you want us to begin that really do tell the story of the independence.
Yeah, look, the Western Cape is fascinating, right? So couple of key things. So remember, it rained really badly in Cape Town.
Yeah, right? In Cape Town.
And hectic rain has a kind of suppressing force on turnout, but it particularly has a suppressing force on turnout in poorer areas and indigent areas and people who don't have a vehicle, people who don't have a very nice, comfortable voting station to go to. And so you see this just gigantic differential between turnout in the townships in Cape Town and the suburbs in Cape Town. So like suburban Cape Town turned out 63%, township Cape Town turned out 37%. So just enormous difference in turnout, really driving the DA numbers in a massive way. So that's the one major force. And then the other major force is just the same one we discussed in Nelson Mandela Bay, which is the splintering of the coloured electorate, right? The DA used to win like 78% of the coloured vote in, I don't have the stats for all Western Cape, but for Cape Town, they're down to like 61, 62. So that's it's a massive swing. They've basically lost like 20% of the coloured vote since 2016. And it's gone to Good, it's gone to all sorts of small parties, the Cape Coloured Congress. It's not gone to the ANC, which is interesting. The ANC is just basically dead in Cape Town, to be honest. And it's gone to, as I said, Cape Coloured Congress, to Good, a little bit to the ACDP, a little bit to independents all over. And then, you see the same effect in other parts of the Western Cape. So votes going to independents, so a little bit of a bleed off to the Freedom Front Plus from the DA, a little bit of a bleed off to Good. So a bunch of councils now being in hung territory that used to be fully, run and managed by the DA, which I think will be a little bit of a concern to the DA. But, overall, still a pretty good result on average for the DA in the Western Cape because of turnout, but also holding, relatively firm with the rest of the electorate outside of the coloured electorate. So, 58% in Cape Town, they're down 8, but it's not horrendous. They're probably going to be able to create coalition governments in most of these hung councils, so not horrendous. And then just the other thing that we need to talk about is the independents, and actually specifically the one SA independents. So I will confess.
Dawie, sorry, yes. I must interject that just to bring the question up from a viewer. Sorry about that. It's to that particular point. Ubonkle Mataboche is basically asking that exact question, Dawie. How many of these independents who ran under Musi's 1SA actually won? I see the corporate meets attributing the rise of independence to Musi, but most of the candidates she's suggesting weren't even affiliated to 1SA.
Yeah, exactly. And look, so I will confess I haven't done this analysis. I don't have the answer. We need to do it. But my sense is not that many, right? Because there are a lot of independents that won that were not necessarily affiliated with the 1SA movement. And the other thing is also there's like every vote for an independent on the ward ballot gets discarded from the calculation in terms of what the overall percentage is, right? Jesus. So the question is also, how many anti-ANC votes were thrown out of the calculation by being for independence, right? And it's probably an enormous number. It's probably like, I would imagine it's the vast, vast, vast majority of those independent votes are basically dead anti-ANC votes. So honestly, like this idea of like trying to drive in a coordinated way independent election, like, honestly, I just don't see it's feasible given the way the election system works. And also, that trying to run as independents in the election in 2024, look, the election system has not even been set up for that yet, right? But if it is set up in the way where everyone across the country can vote for an independent, right? And if an independent gets enough seats to go to parliament, then that person goes to parliament. There's an enormous risk in that, because let's say Musi were to run as an independent candidate and 1 million people were to vote for Musi. He only needs 50,000 votes to make it to parliament. What happens with the other 950,000 votes, I don't know. And presumably, it probably will get thrown out, right? But the election system needs to be written in a way that makes sense for that to make any sense whatsoever. And I'm doubtful it will make any sense.
Very valid points.
So I'm not impressed by this independent strategy, to be perfectly honest. And someone needs to do the analysis. My expectation is that the vast majority of the independent votes for this election were basically thrown out because they were for ward candidates that lost their wards, basically.
Again, very valid analysis. And Nicolas, I must bring it to you for a moment, because we will leave the the Western Cape and head to other provinces where we saw the surge of the independents. And we see two particular trends. And Dawie, I'll bring you back in, and the rest of the fellas, because I think we'll end the conversation at this juncture. Insofar as saying where we've seen the rise of independence, there's two particular streams. The one, of course, is the idea that the independent stands because they're sick and tired of the mainstream parties, in inverted commas. And the other, of course, is very particular local and issues-based independence. Chaps who argue that, hey, maybe sorting out the issues we have shouldn't happen as us being quote-unquote traditional career politicians, but actually as folks who've been doing stuff as activists or doing stuff as just the ordinary Joe. For example, Harry Smith presents a good example of that, albeit with a pinch of salt. But let's keep to the Western Cape for a moment, and let me just go to my shared screen here, because I want to come to Cedarburg to make this particular case of that first layer or level or type, rather, of the independent. Very local-based, very issues of the particular town-based, and people seem to gravitate towards that. I mean, look at the Cedarburg, sorry, I forgot their name. Cedarburg.
Cedarburg Eerste, I think it was.
Sorry, I can't think of the.
Cedarburg First.
There we go.
Cedarburg First.
But, talk to me. Is this something which we might see sort of going forward when it comes to local government elections? Is this a trend?
So I would say that it's quite likely to be a trend. I think, though, that a lot of it depends how this sort of plays out. So I would like to also make a distinction between what we might call independents, who are people who run as themselves, and minnows, the little parties that exist in places. And Cedarburg First is one of those examples of a minnow party. They really did well. I mean, if you look at, for example, the Joburg Council this time, and I'm going out of the Western Cape, there are a huge number of tiny parties all over that place now.
Yeah.
And I think that this is only going to encourage more, because when people, who don't really fit in anywhere else, see other tiny parties having successes, getting a seat here or there, they think to themselves, well, maybe I should get in as well. Yeah. And I mean, this time, I don't know about the rest of the country, but at least in Joburg, the proportional representation ballot was massive. It was like this big because it had so many parties on it. And I think that, South Africa is, despite what a lot of the lazy analysis has kind of painted the country as being, actually very complicated and diverse in very many ways under the sort of surface. And what we're really seeing is every sort of local factional political dispute now beginning to be expressed in the political arena. Before, a lot of this was contained within the ANC, right? An ANC faction would fight with another one, but ultimately the ANC would still win the ward. I think that seems to be over now. We're seeing, like in Harry Smith, as you say, there were these guys who got chucked out of the ANC. What are they called? MAP 16, winning 20 seats in the Harry Smith council and the area around there. We've seen there's another party in the Free State called the SSDF, also a very small local party on the border with Lesotho, winning seats there. And there's also a party, I think, called the ABC in KZN, who've clawed out a couple of seats there. So I really think this trend of fragmentation is probably going to continue, unless the bigger parties, particularly sort of the DA, IFP and such, can convince people that these little parties are not really worth voting for. So the DA was very successful in doing that over the years. But with the ANC looking weaker, they might not have as strong an argument for that anymore, because the smaller parties will say, look, it's fine. We might go into an anti-ANC coalition, or we might hold the ANC accountable if we go into coalition with them, so you can vote for us without in danger of just maintaining the status quo. And that's a conundrum that the bigger parties are going to have to deal with.
Absolutely. And maybe, as we begin to taper the conversation off, fellas, we'll just go for another 15 minutes, and that's it. We'll call it an evening from there, which will give us a nice opportunity, therefore, to conclude our thoughts. Because remember, we began our conversation generally by arguing that the nature of this election lent itself, to our future politics being about what happens after the election, which is the coalition talks, right? And there are those who are in tears at the moment, who've seen their numbers absolutely decimated, and even replaced. For example, I've just gone to Maluti Pofang or Harry Smith, just to make that particular point. The DA used to be the party that comes in, traditionally as second place to the ANC. But now you're finding, as we're focusing on independents, all these new parties, let's group those two together, independents and new parties, basically becoming kingmakers in these elections. Let me come to you, Dumo, then I'll say Dawie, and then Koketso. Dumo, it really is a situation when we look at this particular municipality, a lot of the guys who form MAP, if I'm not mistaken, were those chaps who beforehand were seen as active community members, if I'm not mistaken. These are the chaps who are fixing the water, for example, in Harry Smith. I might be crossing my wires here. But Dawie, maybe let me just come to you first. I just want to make sure I'm not crossing my wires here. But are these not the chaps who were fixing the water there, who then formed their own little independent thing and ran under that, or is this just another independent grouping?
No, so you're right. So the genesis of this group was basically a group. It's called MAP 16 because 16 councillors that in this council had been expelled by the ANC.
That's right.
And the reason they were expelled is because they had accused the municipal manager of and blew the whistle on basically the municipal manager engaging in corrupt activities.
Yes.
And then they got expelled, and the municipal manager got promoted to, I think, be the speaker of the Free State Provincial Legislature or something at the time by Ace Magashule. And so then they were like, all right, we're out. Cheers, because. And they formed this new party called MAP 16, obviously because it's the 16 who got expelled. But interestingly, also then, it became a bit broader. They partnered with other local organizations. There are actually like elements that usually voted DA that, like local farmers organizations and stuff that started working with them. So it grew into something bigger, which shows you the result, right? And I think just that's the blueprint for how you perform well at local government level as an independent party. You are deeply rooted in the community. You know the community knows you. You understand the issues. You have a history of doing things about those issues, and you have a good story about you, right? And so I think that's one of the great success stories for independent movements in this election.
Absolutely. Sorry, I just had to clarify that, and you're quite right, because I forgot which because there was a factional breakaway, and this is clearly it, which did exactly what you mentioned. But Dumo, let me come to you, because I think there is a story to be told here around the emergence of the traditionally smaller parties becoming kingmakers in this election, and maybe this boding well. If you want to view it this way, but this boding well for maybe the upcoming 2024 elections. But before you answer that, maybe conclude where we began this conversation around someone like Musi, because Musi is going out guns blazing, claiming victory for all instances that we're seeing of there being an independent candidate. And I think Dawie made a great eviscerating argument, not directly aimed at Musi, but on the notion of independence generally, that it could be a bit of a a futile exercise.
Yeah, look, the independent candidates are not getting a lot of votes. So I think when Musi's trying to claim victory, I just think he's trying to get his name in the media so that he can still be relevant. So he's being just a typical politician, trying to stay in the sights of the media so that people can remember him. So it's typical. It's typical. I mean, I'm not saying that he shouldn't do it, but I don't blame him. It's politics.
Sorry,
is tough.
can I very quickly jump in there? He also got given a bunch of money, and I think he's trying to justify the fact that the people gave him the money.
Oh, there you go. Again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh at him, but I mean, it's a function of guys. There are clear trends in this election. And if anything, the biggest winners are the quote-unquote smaller parties and those locally based in quote-unquote, I shouldn't call them independents. I think they're just locally based small parties that did the job that Musi argued that he and One SA were going to do. I think is that not more an honest reflection, Dumo and then Koketso and then Dawie?
Yeah, I would say that argument does seem plausible. The thing about independence is just that getting support is very difficult, especially when you're running against established parties and smaller parties. Just putting your name out there, it's just a very difficult task to achieve. And also I think just on the theme of the smaller parties becoming kingmakers. I mean, I wouldn't say the EFF is a small party, but I mean it's much smaller than the EFF and the DA. And they are going to play kingmakers in the major metros. And I think in the smaller municipalities, we'll start seeing the smaller parties doing the same thing as well. As you could see with Map 16, I mean, Map 16 managed to get a lot of support, mainly due to the fact that a lot of them were part of the ANC and people knew them and they got involved in the community and so forth. But for independents, it's just going to be it's so much more difficult, unless you got a big name, unless like your name is, let's say, Malema, for example, and he runs as an independent, then maybe that would work. But I think, with Musi and his 1SA, it's not, they have to do a bit more work, in my opinion. But definitely, I agree with the idea of the smaller parties becoming the kingmakers. And this is what I want. This is basically what I want, because this will force the bigger parties to meet halfway with the smaller ones, as opposed to them just driving their policies through because they got majority and they face no opposition.
Oh, well, Koketso, I must come to you, Chief, because there's a conversation once again to be had here insofar as Umusi, and I'm sorry to dwell on this, but I think it's important that we just unpack this issue. The whole thing was chaotic, man. It was just chaotic from the beginning. Oh, here's this brand that we're establishing called the One SA movement. Oh, but also, no, ignore that, because you won't see that. You'll see a whole bunch of independents who have to go through a list to try and find out whether they're affiliated to us or not. Chaos. And I'm not seeing the return on investment here, unless I'm wrong, and I'm happy to be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago on Liberty and Friends as well, that I like the idea of, having independent candidates coming under one umbrella. It's a hell of a lot easier to market. Some have more budget than others. So if you pull them together, you can actually, it can be more effective, or let me rather say more efficient. I think now where it fails, and someone's mentioned this in the comment, and that a lot of the time, this isn't actually someone who's trying to legitimately better the life of people in their community, but maybe someone who's looking for a job. And if there's one type of person I do not trust, period, is a career politician. So I don't know much about the people who were in that umbrella, but if there were career politicians in there, I'd see right through the smoke and just see this as someone who doesn't have a political home and is trying to, maybe be a ward councillor so they can draw a salary and pay tax. That's how I see it. But yeah, I like the idea. Obviously, this is very new. Remember, from a legislative perspective, it's quite recent that the Concord did say that independent candidates can go ahead and run. So I'm glad that this, in the very first elections, whether national or local, I'm glad that someone actually took it upon themselves to actually try this out. Let's see how far it goes. I don't want to discount it. I want to literally see if people will actually stand behind the idea of independent candidates. Because when we didn't have that option, we just kept hearing over and over again about why can't we have independents? So now that there are independents, I'm glad that Musi's done what he's done. I'm glad that even the Map 16 guys went ahead and did what they did. But I don't want to write them off. Long story short, does it resonate with the South African people? No, it doesn't. In the same way that, much of the educated population aren't really fans of socialism, if I can put it like that. And that shows clearly in the EFF's polling numbers here. So let's see how it goes. But I don't want to write it off, not at the very least until we've had a national election where there are independent candidates who could, quote unquote, potentially be premiers of a province. I don't know.
Dawie, I must come to you because I think there's something that Koketso reminded me of, and maybe we'll conclude here, fellas. And I'll give everybody last thoughts. The story of the EFF in this election, I would argue, is slightly disappointing because it almost seemed as if the only thing we were really seeing, yes, there was growth in inverted commas, but am I right in almost suggesting that the growth is a bit of a double-edged sword because it wasn't really growth more than it was a case of their 2019 showing reflecting in this election. So even in that regard, there seems to be a cap, an unspoken cap we're seeing in the EFF, or am I wrong?
No, you're exactly right. That is exactly it. Stagnant result, 2019 repeating itself. They've got a cap because not a lot of South Africans want super radical policies. They want practical things that can actually make their life better. But I actually want to answer or make a final contribution to the discussion we just had about European independence. The ANC got under 50% for the first time in an election. The wrong track numbers are at 70%. In 2024, it's going to be even worse because all of the problems are just going to continue. It is an historical opportunity for explosive electoral change in South Africa. And it's time for the opposition parties and for people who are generally rationally minded towards creating an alternative in South Africa to show an extreme level of maturity, get together, both, by the way, in these coalition discussions that are ongoing, but also beyond the coalition, and think about how to contest 2024. Because the old way of doing things with the old brands and the old approach is, I don't think, going to cut it, and is not going to realize the opportunity that 2024 actually holds for opposition politics in South Africa. And, Musi running outside of that in an independent environment, I don't think has the electoral impact as potentially in-housing with a real, larger, reformed alternative. So it's time for people who have real decision-making power in opposition politics to get real mature and think about how to completely crack the 2024 and create revolutionary change in the electorate. And it's not the same old, same old. Some compromises have to be made, and it's going to require real maturity. And I know my comment is probably quite naive and probably quite idealistic, but it's just self-evidently the right thing. And now really is the time, based on the result that we had last week. And that's my final comment.
Absolutely, and thanks, because I would genuinely partially agree with that, dude. I mean, and the data is absolutely crystal clear in that regard. Insofar as if you look at the number of people who are eligible to vote who don't vote, that also tells you a big story. Insofar as them looking in at the current pool of politicians and saying none of these people represent what I believe should be the future of the country at a governance level going forward. So there's clearly a story to be told in that regard. That, of course, is Dawie Scholtz. Final thoughts, fellas, before we wrap up the show. Let me move to you. Hang on, Dawie. Don't leave just yet. We're going to wrap up in 3 minutes. Dumo, final thoughts.
Yeah, great election. Love the results. I'm looking forward to seeing how these coalitions are going to develop. And I hope this trend continues into 2024. And when I say trend, I'm not referring to the low voter turnout. I'm talking about just the trend of having a bigger opposition to the ANC and the EFF.
All right. Absolutely. Nick, final thoughts?
Yeah, we're at a point of change, I think, in our political scene, and it's going to be very exciting to see what comes out of this. Could be very good, could be very bad. It's up to how the party players play it in the next couple of months.
Absolutely. And of course, Koketso, homie, final thoughts.
Yeah, good to see that the ANC now has to work for their votes, unlike before. So yeah, going under that 50% is a major milestone. Then final things from my end. It's also good to see that, just like we predicted, the good party is, they're nowhere to be seen. In fact, the Patriotic Alliance has basically swallowed up their voter base for good reason, in that Patricia de Lille was quickly introduced into Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet. So that did feel like a betrayal. I did mention this at Manpatria the other time, that, this is a betrayal, and it's now showing in these elections. And then a final thought, the ANC's favorite venue there, next to Gallagher Estate, that is St. George's Hotel, that went to the DA with an outright majority in that ward.
Well, good might be feeling a bit hard done by. I mean, they did reasonably well in some parts of the Western Cape, but I mean, overall, I think you're right. I mean, given the rhetoric beforehand and versus the results, I don't know if they are as happy as they should be. Speaking of venues that were a lot more sad and morose, Cubana in Durban after these elections, a usual haunt for the ANC, spending often hundreds of thousands per evening, was very quiet after these Durban election results. So maybe that tells you everything you need to know. Fellas, I must wrap it up there and thank every single one of you for having joined us on the stream. Perhaps the last thing is, how do the folks find you on social media? Very quickly, Dawie, if you want to be found, how do the folks find you?
I'm on Twitter at Dawie Scholtz.
Excellento. Dumo?
On Twitter at Dumo Denga.
And of course, subscribe and watch the Manpatria podcast on social media and on YouTube. Koketso, how do the folks find you?
That's Koketso Resane on Twitter. Leftists beware. I carry a sniper rifle.
Shout out to you, Koketso. Shout out to you, Koketso. Nick, how do the folks find you on your social media? And of course, Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree.
Yeah, I'm not on Twitter. It's evil. But you can find the Daily Friend Show on YouTube and on your podcast apps, and you can find the Two Crickets and a Thorn Tree podcast on the dailyfriend.co.za and on podcast apps.
Excellento. That is, of course, my panel guests for this evening. As I get them off screen, a big thank you to all of them, and a thank you, dear viewer, for watching this episode of Liberty and Friends. Apologies for it coming on a Monday and not Sunday as traditional, but I said, hey, there's some guests who I definitely want to have on here so that you guys can pose your questions to them. What are your thoughts? Get me the comments get the comments going in the comment section. It's always nice to sit after the show and see what you guys thought about the conversation. That being said, massive thank you once again. And remember, if you want to support the Big Daddy Liberty Show and the work that I do, it's very simple. Check it out in the descriptor of this video, and you can make a monthly contribution to the show. With that being said, thank you very much. Big thank you. And remember, as I always say at the end of every show, never trust, you thought I forgot, never trust a commie.